Mzilikazi kaMashobane abandoned King Shaka's empire, the deadliest military force in southern Africa. His choice would reshape an entire continent. 300 warriors followed him into exile. No land, no army, no certainty. Not one soldier turned back toward Shaka's kingdom. Within 2 decades, that desperate column had become 20,000 soldiers, their footsteps thundering across the land. They controlled 75,000 square miles, a kingdom forged from nothing. History would bury it, but not the power it held. To understand what Mzilikazi built, you must first see where he came from. Born into the Kumalo clan in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, Mzilikazi inherited both blood and burden. His father Mashobane held standing among the northern Nguni people. Yet from boyhood, Mzilikazi moved differently than other men, deliberate, watchful, patient. People trusted him because they sensed something forming beneath the surface. He came of age when the earth itself was shaking. Shaka Kasinzangakona was reshaping every kingdom within striking distance with devastating force. The Zulu military machine absorbed clans, broke rivals, and rewrote borders in blood. Mzilikazi did not resist this storm. Instead, he entered it. He joined Shaka's army, rising through the ranks with strategic brilliance. And Shaka recognized what he had. He made Mzilikazi a commander within the Zulu army structure. Shaka's commanders learned the full tactical system, the formation logic, the discipline codes. They learned the Impondo Zankomo, the chest and horns formation. A center mass drives forward while 2 flanking columns loop wide and close behind the enemy. Total encirclement. No retreat route left open. Mzilikazi studied this. He would use it for the rest of his life. But here is what nobody tells you about that formation. It was not just a battle tactic. It was a philosophy of how power moves. You do not meet your enemy head-on. You surround the conditions that made him dangerous. Mzilikazi absorbed that lesson deep. For several years, he served Shaka with distinction. And then came the moment that changed everything. In 1823, Mzilikazi rode north, determined to seize the Sotho herds. The raid succeeded. The cattle were taken. But Mzilikazi did not send them back to Shaka. He kept them. Whether this was deliberate defiance or a calculated break, historians are divided. What is not in dispute is what Shaka did next. He sent an execution force after Mzilikazi. Return and likely die. Or run and build something new in open hostile territory. He chose to run. He chose to build. When Mzilikazi finally departed, he moved north with 300 Kumalo warriors and their families, a calculated exodus carrying the seeds of empire. 300 people stepping off the edge of the known world. Rival groups controlled water sources, grazing land, crossing points. So here is the question nobody asks. How do 300 people survive long enough to become an empire? The answer is the military system Mzilikazi built in motion, while moving. He organized while walking. Young men between roughly 14 and 18 years old were folded into training as the group moved. They entered the Amabuto system, organized age regiments with distinct names and distinct roles. Each regiment had its own identity, its own shield markings, its own battle honors. A young man entering this system had to know exactly who he was, or perish among thousands. He knew his place in the chest. He knew if he was a horn. This was not casual organization. This was a professional warrior class built on the move. Men in this system could not marry until military service was complete. That rule seemed small. It was not small. It meant loyalty to the regiment came before loyalty to a household. Because the Ndebele army was not merely part of society, it fundamentally transformed the very structure of how society moved and breathed. The army became the spine. Without it, nothing could stand. Mzilikazi understood that a kingdom needs a center of gravity before it needs walls. And then came the first real test of what he had built. The Boers expected linear engagement, rifles against shields. A manageable fight. The center column engaged. The horns moved wide before the Boers could wheel their horses. Mounted men are fast in a straight line. They are not fast inside a closing circle. Ndebele forces defeated commando units at the Vaal River in engagements that stunned observers. This was not luck. This was doctrine applied with precision. Word of these engagements spread faster than any messenger could ride. Subordinate Sotho and Shona chieftaincies began paying tribute rather than fighting. Not all of them chose peacefully, but many did the math. Because here is the truth about how Mzilikazi expanded his power. He used military force where he had to, and political absorption where he could. Chieftaincies that submitted became part of the Ndebele network, not eliminated from it. Their men joined the Amabatho. Their cattle flowed into the tribute system. This was not generosity. It was efficient architecture. An empire that destroys everything it touches runs out of people to control. Mzilikazi built something that could grow and still hold its shape. By 1840, the Ndebele Kingdom at Bulawayo controlled roughly 75,000 square miles. Tribute networks stretched hundreds of miles in multiple directions. Mzilikazi built his capital at Bulawayo, in what is now Zimbabwe. The name Bulawayo means the place of killing, a name that carried both warning and authority. He had transformed a hunted people into a sovereign nation in less than 2 decades. The kingdom did not fall to a better army. It fell to a new kind of weapon entirely. Not iron, paper. The British South Africa Company received its royal charter in 1889. That charter gave a private corporation the legal authority to govern and police territory. Cecil Rhodes sat at the center of that arrangement. He was not a general. He was something harder to fight than a general. He was a man with shareholders, lawyers, and a government willing to look the other way. And he had identified exactly what he wanted. The land between the Limpopo and the Zambezi rivers held gold and diamond prospects. Ndebele territory sat directly on top of those prospects. Rhodes sent a delegation to Bulawayo in 1888. They came with gifts, translators, and a document written in careful legal English. Mzilikazi was gone by then, dead in 1868 after 40 years of building. His son Lobengula sat in his place, carrying a kingdom he had not chosen to inherit. Lobengula was not a simple man. He spoke multiple languages, ran a sophisticated court, and understood that visitors with documents were dangerous. He had watched what happened to neighboring kingdoms that signed things. So he stalled, he negotiated, he asked for time. But Rhodes had already written the outcome before the delegation arrived. Lobengula believed he was granting limited mining rights in one region. The English text gave Rhodes exclusive rights over all metals and minerals across the entire territory. One document, 2 completely different agreements depending on which language you read. When Lobengula learned what the English text actually said, he sent messengers to Queen Victoria directly. He wrote clearly. He said he had not granted what the document claimed. His letter reached London. It was received. It was filed. Nothing changed. Because here is where it turns. The British government did not need Lobengula to agree. They needed him to have signed something. Anything. Any mark on any paper they could show to other European powers at the Berlin Conference table. No African leader was present at that table. Not one. Lobengula's signature, whatever he intended it to mean, became the legal justification for everything that followed. Your name on a piece of paper you did not fully understand, used to take everything you built. The pioneer column entered Ndebele-controlled territory in 1890, 500 men, armed, moving in formation. Lobengula did not attack. He had learned to wait, to measure his enemy. He had seen what happened when African armies met British rifles in open country. By 1893, the British South Africa Company's police force had moved into direct conflict. The trigger was a cattle dispute with the Shona people living under Ndebele authority. Company forces intervened. Lobengula's generals responded. Lobengula wrote one more letter to the British High Commissioner. He asked what he had done to deserve war. 3 columns converged on Bulawayo from different directions. Maxim guns, a weapon that could fire 600 rounds per minute. Ndebele forces fought with the Impondo Zankomo, the same formation Mzilikazi had built his kingdom on. The chest engaged, the horns moved wide. But the Maxim gun does not have flanks. It covers a 180-degree arc and does not run out of breath. The formation that had stopped Boer commandos at the Vaal River in the 1830s could not solve this. This was not a failure of courage or tactics. It was a technology gap that no amount of military genius could close in the time available. Lobengula burned Bulawayo before the columns arrived. He would not let them have what his father built. The capital Mzilikazi had named the place of killing. He turned to ash rather than surrender. Lobengula fled north with a small group of followers. The exact location of his death was never confirmed by witnesses who survived. And then the company got to work on something more lasting than military victory. They renamed the territory Rhodesia, after Cecil Rhodes, a kingdom built by one man's name, overwritten by another man's name. Land that Ndebele families had farmed and grazed was reclassified as company property. The Amabuto system, the age regiment structure that was the spine of Ndebele society, was formally dissolved. Men who had been warriors with rank and identity were reclassified as labor. The three-tier structure Mzilikazi built over decades, the Zansi, the Enla, and the Lozwi, was erased on paper. Not by conquest alone, by administration, by census forms that did not have a category for what these people were, by land laws that did not recognize how they had organized ownership, by school curricula that began in the 1900s and taught Rhodesian history, not Ndebele history. It was 1,000 small bureaucratic decisions, each one replacing one word with another. Warrior became laborer. Kingdom became territory. Bulawayo became a colonial town. The same streets, different names on every building. Missionaries arrived alongside the administrators. They were sincere in their belief that they were helping, and that sincerity made them more effective at erasure than any soldier could have been. Mzilikazi did not appear in those lessons as a king or a strategist. When he appeared at all, it was as a raider who had troubled the region before order arrived. Reduced to a footnote about instability, the land did not forget what the administrators tried to rename. Bulawayo still stands today, a city of over 600,000 people. The streets Lobengula burned rather than surrender were rebuilt on the same soil, same ground, new names on every corner. That is what erasure looks like when the physical world refuses to cooperate. What was lost was not just a kingdom. What was lost was a system of knowing, an entire architecture of how power could be organized. The Amabuto age regiment structure had solved a problem most states never solve. How do you build loyalty that outlasts the man who created it? Mzilikazi answered that with shield markings and battle honors. Identity that a young man could hold in his hands. That answer was erased from history books, lost in administrative silence, in forms that had no category for African genius. The Land Apportionment Act of 1930 in Rhodesia moved the mechanism forward. It divided land by race, reserving the most productive soil for white settlement. Ndebele families, who had grazed specific land for generations, found themselves reclassified as occupants without title. Not by a battle, by a column in a ledger. 2 generations of children grew up in what the administration called native reserves. Land that could not produce enough. Land chosen for its limitations. The schools that replaced the knowledge were not neutral institutions. The Southern Rhodesia Education Act of 1931 formalized what the missionary schools had started. English language, British history, a curriculum designed for a different hemisphere entirely. A child sitting in a classroom in Matabeleland in 1940 learned about Tudor kings. Not one lesson on the Impondos and Como. Not one lesson on the tribute network. Not one lesson on the man who had built a functioning state on this exact soil. What the Maxim gun could not finish, the lesson plan completed. Oral historians inside Ndebele communities kept the lineages alive. Praise singers called Izimbongi held fast to names of regiments, the sequence of kings, the geography of battles. They stood in the gap between what had been and what colonial administration insisted had never existed. Some of those lineages survived into the 20th century intact. Some did not. Cecil Rhodes died in 1902, leaving a will endowing scholarships in a territory bearing his name. Rhodes scholarships still operate today, funded partly by wealth extracted through the Rudd concession. Lobengula's signature on a document he disputed built some of the most prestigious academic funding in the world. That chain of consequence is not interpretation. It is the sequence of events. Zimbabwe became an independent nation on April 18, 1980. Independence changed the flag. It did not immediately change the soil allocation. Land reform discussions began immediately after independence and continued through the 1980s and 90s without resolution. By 2000, the land question had become a crisis that drew international condemnation from multiple directions. One concession, over a century of consequence still unfolding. Here is what that means in human terms. Families farming land their grandparents had farmed without legal title, because the legal system had been built to exclude them. The maps the company drew stayed in place long after the company was gone. Southern Rhodesia became a self-governing colony in 1923. The company dissolved. The landlines held. Institutions outlived the people who built them, a cold comfort to the dead. That is perhaps the most durable lesson of what happened to the Ndebele Kingdom. Mzilikazi understood this from the other direction. He built institutions meant to outlast him. The Amabutho system, the tribute network, the court at Bulawayo, all designed to function after his death. He died in 1868, and the kingdom ran for another 25 years. That is what durable institution building looks like. What Rhodes built was also durable. That is the uncomfortable parallel. Both men built systems designed to run without them. One system lifted people into structure and identity. The other extracted and displaced. Historians at the National Archives of Zimbabwe have worked since independence to recover Ndebele oral records. Some lineages were recovered. Some were not recovered in time. Zimbabwean scholarship examining Ndebele military frameworks more formally in the early 2000s confirmed details of the Amabutho structure that colonial-era sources had dismissed as exaggerated or invented. The knowledge survived. It survived in people, not in institutions the colonial government had funded. That is a specific kind of endurance. Mzilikazi's gravesite near Ntumbane stands as the Ndebele people's quiet triumph. Ndebele community groups have maintained it across different political periods. No colonial administrator chose to preserve it. No company official marked it. People kept it. The Zimbabwean government formally recognized Mzilikazi as a founding figure of the nation in the years following independence. He appears in the national curriculum, rebuilt after 1980 to reflect the land's actual history. The presence of his name in a lesson plan does not undo the decades when it was absent, but it marks something, a decision to stop the erasure from running forward. What was taken was not just territory. It took the future the Ndebele Kingdom had been building toward. A political structure that had absorbed, rather than eliminated, was replaced by one that classified and excluded. One was built for growth. The other was built to extract. The difference in those designs is still visible in southern African land records today. Praise singers kept standing in fields with no official backing, no government funding, keeping a name alive that 3 separate administrations had decided should disappear. The knowledge settled into the soil of a kingdom, into the memory of a people, into records that survived because some refused to let them disappear. Mzilikazi did not lose because his army was weaker. He lost because paper outlasted iron, and penholders controlled courts, maps, and schools. The Izimbongi knew that. They whispered his name across Zimbabwe for centuries after.